You know what's wild? The United States spent 4 decades trying to crush Iran's economy. 4 decades. Sanctions, embargoes, asset freezes, banking blacklists, oil export bans, every weapon in the economic warfare playbook. The goal was simple: strangle Iran financially until it either collapsed or came crawling to the negotiating table, defeated and desperate. But here's the thing nobody talks about. It didn't work. Not only did it not work, it backfired so spectacularly that Iran's economy became more resilient, more self-sufficient, and in some bizarre ways, more innovative than it ever would have been without the pressure. America tried to destroy Iran's economy and ended up creating something far more dangerous, an economic fortress that doesn't play by Western rules anymore. This isn't a story about politics. This is a masterclass in unintended consequences. Because when you try to kill something and it survives, it doesn't just come back. It comes back stronger, angrier, and immune to the very weapons you used against it. Let's rewind to 1979. The Iranian Revolution just toppled the Shah, who was America's guy in the Middle East. The new Islamic Republic, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, was openly hostile to the United States. Then came the hostage crisis. 52 Americans held captive for 444 days. Washington's response was immediate and brutal: economic isolation, freeze Iranian assets, cut off trade, strangle their banking system. The message was clear: play ball with us or watch your economy burn. At first, it looked like it was working. Iran's GDP collapsed, inflation skyrocketed, foreign investment vanished overnight. The Iranian rial became almost worthless on global markets. Western economists predicted total collapse within a decade. Iran, they said, would have no choice but to bend the knee. But Iran didn't collapse. Instead, something unexpected happened. The sanctions forced Iran to do something most oil-rich nations never bothered to do: diversify. See, most petrostates are lazy. They pump oil, sell it for dollars, import everything else, and call it an economy. Iran couldn't do that anymore. The sanctions cut them off from easy money, easy imports, easy everything. So they had to build things themselves. And build they did. Within a decade, Iran went from importing basic goods to manufacturing cars, pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals, steel, cement, and military hardware. They couldn't buy weapons from the West, so they reverse-engineered drones, missiles, and radar systems. They couldn't access global banking, so they created shadow financial networks that moved billions without touching a single Western bank. They couldn't sell oil on open markets, so they built a fleet of ghost tankers that turned off their tracking systems and sold crude to anyone willing to pay cash. This wasn't supposed to happen. Sanctions were supposed to cripple them, not make them creative. But that's the paradox of economic warfare. When you cut someone off from the system, you also free them from its rules. Let's talk specifics. Take Iran's pharmaceutical industry. Before sanctions, Iran imported most of its medicine from Europe and the United States. Then the sanctions hit, and suddenly Iranian patients couldn't get critical medications. Cancer treatments, insulin, antibiotics, all vanished from pharmacies overnight. It was a humanitarian disaster. But instead of begging for relief, Iran's government poured money into domestic drug production. Today, Iran manufactures over 97% of its own medications. They export generic drugs to over 50 countries. They're one of the top producers of biosimilars in the world. The sanctions turned Iran into a regional pharmaceutical powerhouse. Or look at their automotive industry. In the early 2000s, French carmaker Peugeot was Iran's biggest partner, producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles a year in joint ventures. Then, in 2012, the US tightened sanctions and threatened secondary penalties on any company doing business with Iran. Peugeot pulled out. So did other European manufacturers. Iran's auto industry should have died. Instead, local companies like Iran Khodro and Saipa expanded production, improved designs, and started exporting to Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, and parts of Africa. By 2020, Iran was producing over 1 million vehicles a year, making it one of the largest car manufacturers in the Middle East. Now, are these cars as good as a Mercedes or a Toyota? No, but that's not the point. The point is, Iran built an entire industrial base that wouldn't exist if the West had kept doing business with them. Sanctions didn't destroy Iran's economy. They transformed it from a rentier state into a manufacturing hub. And then there's oil. This is where it gets really interesting. Oil is Iran's lifeblood. It's also the main target of US sanctions. For years, Washington has tried to block Iran from selling crude on global markets. They've sanctioned Iranian tankers, blacklisted refineries, and pressured buyers to stop purchasing Iranian oil. And yes, it hurt. Iran's oil exports dropped from 2.5 million barrels a day to under $500,000 at the height of Trump's maximum pressure campaign. But here's what happened next. Iran went dark. They created an entire underground oil trade that operates completely outside the Western financial system. They rebranded tankers under different flags. They They used ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean to hide the origin of the crude. They sold oil to China, Syria, and Venezuela using currencies other than the dollar: yuan, rubles, even cryptocurrencies. Some estimates suggest Iran still moves over 1 million barrels a day through these shadow networks. The sanctions didn't stop the oil from flowing. They just made it invisible. And every time the U.S. tries to tighten the noose, Iran finds a new loophole. When sanctions blocked access to the SWIFT banking system, Iran built its own alternative called CPAM and joined Russia's MIR payment network. When Western tech companies stopped providing services, Iran developed its own apps, platforms, and digital infrastructure. When global e-commerce shut them out, Iran built Digicala, an Amazon-like platform that now dominates domestic online retail. This is the unintended consequence. Sanctions were supposed to make Iran dependent and desperate. Instead, they made Iran independent and defiant. But let's not pretend this is a success story. The Iranian people have suffered immensely. Inflation regularly hits 40 or 50%. The rial has lost over 90% of its value since 2012. Unemployment is high, especially among young people. Corruption is rampant. Many Iranians live paycheck to paycheck, struggling to afford basic necessities. The sanctions have caused real pain, and it's not the government that bears the brunt, it's ordinary citizens. But here's the brutal irony. That pain hasn't translated into regime change. It hasn't forced Iran to abandon its nuclear program or its support for proxy militias in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. If anything, the economic pressure has rallied nationalist sentiment. When your country is under siege, you don't blame your own government, you blame the aggressor. The sanctions gave Iran's leaders a perfect scapegoat. Every economic failure can be blamed on American cruelty, not domestic incompetence. And while the Iranian people suffer, the Iranian state has grown more powerful. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which controls huge portions of the economy, has thrived under sanctions. Why? Because sanctions create black markets, and black markets reward those who control smuggling, bribery, and enforcement. The IRGC runs the ports, the oil exports, the construction contracts. They're not just a military force, they're a business empire. Sanctions didn't weaken them, sanctions made them richer. So when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you have to ask, who really won here? The US spent trillions of dollars enforcing sanctions, pressuring allies, deploying naval fleets, and waging financial warfare. And what did they get? An Iran that's more isolated, yes, but also more self-reliant, more technologically advanced, and more strategically entrenched in the Middle East than ever before. Meanwhile, Iran's alliances have deepened. They've strengthened ties with Russia and China, both of whom see Iran as a counterweight to American influence. They've built missile arsenals that can strike U.S. bases across the region. They've trained and funded militias that now control significant territory in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. They've advanced their nuclear program to the point where they're weeks away from weapons-grade uranium if they choose to cross that threshold. None of this would have been possible without sanctions. Because sanctions didn't just hurt Iran's economy, they freed Iran from any incentive to cooperate with the West. When you have nothing left to lose, you stop playing defense, you go on offense. Let's zoom out even further. The Iran experiment is teaching the rest of the world a dangerous lesson. You can survive American economic pressure. You can build alternative systems. You can trade outside the dollar. You can ignore the rules and still function. Russia watched Iran and copied the playbook after 2014. China is taking notes. North Korea already proved it could survive total isolation for decades. The more the U.S. uses sanctions as a weapon, the more countries are incentivized to build sanction-proof economies. This is the real cost. Not just that sanctions failed to break Iran, but that they've undermined the very foundation of American financial power. For decades, the dollar was the global reserve currency because everyone needed it to trade. But when you weaponize the dollar, you give other countries a reason to find alternatives. Iran, Russia, China, India, and others are now conducting trade in yuan, rubles, rupees, and even barter systems. They're building payment networks that don't touch New York banks. They're creating a parallel financial world where American sanctions are irrelevant. And once that system is fully operational, the U.S. loses its most powerful weapon. Because if you can't threaten someone's access to the global economy, what leverage do you have left? Military force? That's expensive, unpopular, and often ineffective. Diplomacy? Only works if both sides have something to gain. Sanctions were supposed to be the smart, surgical alternative to war. But if sanctions don't work anymore, what's left? This brings us to the present day. The Biden administration tried to revive the Iran nuclear deal, hoping to ease sanctions in exchange for limits on Iran's nuclear program. But the Iranians aren't interested in half measures anymore. They've spent 40 years building an economy that can survive without Western approval. Why would they give up that hard-won independence for vague promises that the next American president might tear up anyway? And that's the tragedy of this whole saga. The US and Iran could have been partners. Iran has a young, educated population. It has massive natural resources. It sits at a strategic crossroads between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. If relations had normalized in the 1990s or 2000s, Iran could have been a major US ally in the region, a counterbalance to both Saudi Arabia and Russia. Instead, decades of hostility have created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The US treated Iran like an enemy, so Iran became one. Sanctions were supposed to prevent Iran from becoming a regional power. Instead, they forced Iran to develop the exact capabilities: missiles, drones, cyber warfare, asymmetric tactics that make it so dangerous today. It's like trying to drown someone by pushing them underwater, only to discover they've learned to breathe through a reed. You didn't kill them, you just taught them a new skill. Now, let's talk about the broader implications. The Iran case study is a warning to anyone who thinks economic sanctions are a silver bullet. They're not. Sanctions can cause pain, yes. They can slow down economies, create shortages, and make life harder for ordinary people. But they rarely achieve their stated political goals. Why? Because pain doesn't equal compliance. Sometimes pain just breeds resentment and resistance. History is full of examples. Cuba has been under US embargo since 1960. The Castro regime is still there. North Korea has been sanctioned for decades. The Kim dynasty is still there. Venezuela has been under harsh sanctions since 2017. Maduro is still there. Zimbabwe, Myanmar, Syria. The list goes on. Sanctions don't topple governments. They just make those governments more authoritarian, more paranoid, and more willing to inflict suffering on their own people to stay in power. And in Iran's case, the sanctions didn't just fail, they backfired. They turned a vulnerable oil state into a militarized, diversified, and networked power that now operates across the Middle East with near impunity. Iran's proxies control Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a. Its missiles can reach Tel Aviv, Dubai, and Riyadh. Its drones are being used by Russia in Ukraine. Its oil still flows, its economy still functions, and its government shows no sign of backing down. This is what happens when you corner a country and give it no way out. It doesn't surrender. It adapts. And in adapting, it becomes something you never expected. Something harder to contain, harder to predict, and harder to defeat. So what's the lesson here? If you're going to use sanctions, you better make sure they work fast and decisively. Because if they don't, you're not weakening your enemy. You're training them. You're giving them time to innovate, to find workarounds, to build alliances, and to develop a siege mentality that makes them impervious to outside pressure. Iran is the ultimate proof of this. 40 years of sanctions didn't bring Iran to its knees. They brought Iran to a place where it doesn't need the West anymore, where it has its own supply chains, its own financial networks, its own military-industrial complex, and its own vision for the region. And now the US is stuck. It can't ease sanctions without looking weak. It can't tighten them without driving Iran even further into the arms of Russia and China. It can't invade without triggering a regional war that would make Iraq and Afghanistan look like minor skirmishes. And it can't ignore Iran because Iran is now too powerful, too connected, and too strategically important to ignore. This is checkmate. Not the checkmate the US wanted, but checkmate nonetheless. Because after 4 decades of economic warfare, the only thing America has accomplished is proving that Iran can survive anything the West throws at it. And in geopolitics, survival is victory. So here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington wants to admit. America tried to destroy Iran's economy, and all it did was make Iran stronger. Not richer in the traditional sense. Iranian citizens aren't living lavish lives, but richer in resilience and capability and strategic depth. Richer in the kind of power that can't be measured in GDP alone. And that kind of power is far more dangerous than any oil revenue could ever be. Because when you build an economy that doesn't need the global system, you're no longer playing the same game. You're playing a different game with different rules. And the people who wrote the old rule book suddenly don't matter anymore. That's the real story here. Not that sanctions failed, but that in failing, they created the very monster they were designed to prevent. A self-sufficient, technologically advanced, ideologically driven regional power that has learned to thrive in isolation. Iran didn't win because it's brilliant. It won because it had no other choice. And sometimes, when you take away all the easy options, what's left is something far more formidable than comfort ever could have produced. This is the paradox of pressure. Apply too much for too long, and you don't break your enemy. You forge them into steel, and steel, unlike glass, doesn't shatter. It cuts.